Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for those in Europe and Africa, Asia. My name is Russell Sturm. I'm with the International Finance Corporation, IFC, and I have the honor of introducing this webinar session on behalf of the partnership of GOGLA, CGAP, and Lighting Global World Bank Group. This is a webinar intended to introduce those who were not able to participate in the initial workshop in Kigali last month. Introduce everyone to the PAYGO Performance Reporting and Measurement, PAYGO Perform initiative. There's some background noise from one of the panelists. If you'd please mute, I would appreciate it. Thank you. The structure of this 1-hour webinar is that we will be presenting the update and findings and direction and thesis and ethos of the PAYGO Perform initiative, which is a tripartite initiative that's launched by Lighting Global, GOGLA, and CGAP, but which is intended fully to be something which is owned by the stakeholders and industry members and investors in the PAYGO sector, pay-as-you-go energy service. For the structure of this this session, we'll be introducing this. There's two forums and opportunities for participation and feedback by the attendees. One is a poll that we will be conducting towards the end that mimics the poll and the dialogue that took place in the Kigali workshop last month. And then the second is questions and answers, and you're able to type in questions throughout, which we will be keeping track of, and which we will be responding to a few of the questions as time permits at the end of this 1-hour session. So let me get popping on this. Can I have the first slide, please? So the motivation behind this initiative is really the promise of PAYGO off-grid solar as a game-changing approach and business model for enabling energy access at scale. It's quite a capital-intensive and, in fact, debt-intensive a business model. In fact, forecasts are that $2.5 billion are missing to meet the full potential of the sector in the next 5 years, with a $5 billion overall demand for capital. Next slide, please. If you look at the capital appetite of a PAYGO company over its, let's say, a 5-year scale-up process, it's really quite substantial, estimated $70 to $150 million needed for an individual company. And this starts from seed funding up into the setup of the corporation, operating capital, but then we start to get into really running the machine of PAYGO. And market expansion capital is quite a steep and prolonged curve. And this requires both the debt, which is the fuel for the engine, but the equity, which is the foundation that allows the debt to be accessed, even when you have receivables financing and other more mature aspects. So in order to achieve the potential of the sector, what this means is that you have to have an industry which is able to access commercial finance at scale. And for that to happen, let's look at the next slide. It means that a financial sector needs to understand the business model and understand the businesses and be able to appraise and assess them to determine their success and to determine their bankability and to determine their credit profile. However, much like a platypus is a complex animal holding many attributes from multiple different species, so also is a PAYGO company. A vertically integrated PAYGO company actually looks like the aggregation of 4, and in some cases 5, different businesses. The slide illustrates that from manufacturing through software development, through distribution financing, on up. These are complex entities, of which financing is a substantial element. Each of these requires different expertise, and each of these, therefore, looks like a different company. So what are the key performance indicators of a PAYGO company that allows an investment analyst to determine whether that PAYGO company is, in fact, functioning at a high level? And what are the performance dimensions that a PAYGO company can use to determine if it is functioning at a high level and to understand where the holes are in its operation, where the focus needs to be? How does it benchmark itself against other companies? And this gets even more complicated because the business models deployed within the PAYGO family are really quite diverse as well. So for one business model, it may in fact be beneficial to the company that the length of time it takes customers to pay them extends from time to time to a couple of months. So how do you capture all this? What are the key performance indicators? And in fact, what is the language one uses in determining performance for PAYGO companies? Next slide, please. So this need, this miscommunication, this confusion about what is an effective PAYGO company was what the motivation was behind this initiative. This isn't something we just began. Going back to 2016, Gogla and Lighting Global began convening PAYGO companies and investors to try to facilitate this process. And it had the dual purpose of enhancing data use to enable analysis of PAYGO company performance, as I mentioned, but also what clearly has emerged is the value to PAYGO companies of being able to use benchmarking, measurement to optimize their businesses and both facilitate finance, but then also facilitate more effective operations. Earlier this year in Hong Kong at the biennial off-grid solar industry meeting, the Lighting Global Gogla biennial meeting, we brought to the public the results of the initial work. And it had three pieces. One was a taxonomy, which basically provided standardized language for categorizing the various variants of the business models. The second was a KPI technical guide. These were the key performance indicators, the 30 or so that were identified through consultation with industry and investors. This is how you can deploy them in your own models. And the third was a data playbook. So once you're starting to standardize your data collection, how do you use it? How do you use it to improve your operations as a PAYGO operator? The feedback from that conference was multifaceted. One aspect was companies and investors saying, we really need KPIs, which reflected a lack of understanding that this work had been undertaken, and therefore a recognition that we'd been sort of operating outside of the mainstream on this. And we needed to make it a more publicly owned entity and activity. The second was that the KPIs weren't quite what some entities needed. And so we went through a process of, first of all, bringing on board CGAP into the partnership, which brought deep experience technically on data analysis and on digital finance. So in April, the Tripartite Initiative was launched in an effort to perfect these and actually socialize them and have them be a living, breathing, constantly improving, broadly owned resource for the sector. We began in June with consultations and pilots. The consultations were to both the industry and investors. Gogla, GIZ, and ISC all undertook such consultations. And then a piloting of the first version, the ones that we launched in Hong Kong, began with 7 companies, an initiative led by Gogla in partnership with GIZ. This culminated in the end of this stage of the initiative, which was last month and now, with the workshop in Kigali for 70 industry stakeholders that took place last month in Kigali. giving feedback, clearly expressing buy-in to the importance of this, and starting to make commitments to take ownership and lead elements of this. If I could have the next slide, please. And the entities were all there, all participating. And there was an agreement that this was going to become a jointly owned resource of the sector. This is not a CGAP, IFC, World Bank, GOGLA owned, tightly held initiative. We're here as the engine, the rocket fuel, to drive the will and the needs of the sector through PAYGO Perform. So this process really has to be open, has to be self-subscribing, has to be objective, meet multiple parties' needs, technically focused, with clear mechanisms for participation, and we'll get to how this will structure. And so the rest of this session is really intended to give some clarity about the findings of the last stage of consultation and the modeling and testing through PAYGO companies of the KPIs, how we see those KPIs having been reformed and modified in this next stage as a result of that, and what this process will be through which stakeholders in the sector can own and drive this thing going forward to meet these changing needs of the sector. Next, please. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Daphne Pitt from GOGLA. Nikki Kaki is also joining from CGAP, and he will be picking up slides after Daphne, who will introduce him. So with that, I'll introduce you, Daphne. And I think there's some squeaking on your side when you turn off your mute, so be careful of the noise, background noise. Daphne?
Thank you, Russell, and thank you all for attending this webinar. And indeed, it is my pleasure to talk about what Russell just introduced, basically the work we have been doing this past few months. So if you look at what has been done the past few months, it has been working on this initial set of KPIs. But instead of just going forward and reshaping those KPIs, we have done some underground trials. We have done a pilot in East Africa, and also we have done some in-depth consultations on which I will now present the main outcomes. I will start with the East Africa data collection pilot. And just to give you a bit of a feeling of how that looked, we have been working with around 10 PAYGO companies, all working in Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and Rwanda. And what we did with them was actually collecting the KPIs. So even though we knew that maybe those KPIs were not yet perfect, we just decided to actually go ahead and have a look and feel of what it would be to actually collect and report on those KPIs. We have been working with, as I said, 10 companies, and 7 of them were actually sending us the calculated KPIs as well as their comments, and 3 others were only giving us their comments. And the main outcomes, and I mean, we had a lot of learnings, I have to say that. So please, if you want to know more in depth of what has come out, do let us know. But if we stick to the highlights, the outcomes were that 5 out of the 6 high priority KPIs were very easy to report on. The one that was most difficult was the PAR 30. And I think we will talk about PAR 30 more during this webinar, but also in the months to come. What was interesting was that once working on the KPIs, all participants said that it was very useful to them, even though some were more skeptical in the beginning than others. It was not just interesting to the companies to attract investment, but also they found that working with the KPIs gave them a good way of actually improving their own business and of benchmarking against others. However, obviously, a pilot never goes smoothly in all ways. And so some of the learnings were that it was really difficult to compare KPIs across different business models and different pricing models, and that sometimes not all data were available to do the actual calculations. Also, especially in the beginning, in the first round of the KPI of the data collection, not all definitions were clear, and it was difficult also to actually calculate the KPIs looking over different product bundles or loans. So that really ties into the different business and pricing models. What we also found was that sometimes it was difficult to actually see what we meant with the different entries for KPIs. So if we were talking about income, interest income was not taken into account. But also I think more of the several lines of the balance sheet were sometimes difficult to interpret on how to take them along in the calculation or not. But I think one of the main outcomes, besides those more technical bits and pieces, was that for a lot of the companies, what they were missing was a KPI on the overall business performance. Most of the KPIs that we have now are really financially orientated, where companies also said that they would really like some more operational KPIs to measure the overall business performance. So the conclusions that we could draw from these data collection pilot is that it might be easier indeed to look at KPIs per product type. That would make it more easy to compare between different business models. However, it also means a more detailed data collection as well as reporting. So this is something that we should take along going further. One of the other things is that this data collection pilot really was on calculated KPIs. So the different companies, they shared with us their calculated KPIs, and Gogla then tried to aggregate them and see how we could report on them. One of the suggestions is also that we could, instead of collect calculated KPIs, that we could also ask companies to send in their raw data, and that a party could then calculate the KPIs from that. The companies that were participating in the pilot, however, said that there was really a preference on the KPIs. And most important also for now is that there was a real wish to share or to be part of the whole process going further, so that to actually come to a new set or a renewed set of KPIs, the company said that a very inclusive process was needed, and that's what we are setting up right now, and that was also where this webinar is for. Because of the fact that the pilot was really aiming at East African companies, we also said it's good to share the outcomes with a broader group of companies to see if their views are in line with those 10 piloting companies. So what we have done is we have set up a company consultation where we also included companies from West Africa and Asia. And we have also opened up the Gogla Working Group Business Development for consultation for everyone that was interested to share their feedback with us. And a lot of the insights that we gained from those consultations were in line with the data collection pilot. High on the agenda was the need for improved comparability. A lot of companies told us that the difference in business models, pricing models, but also even in geography, make it important to think about how to compare a set of KPIs from one company to the other. Important for ourselves when benchmarking, important for financiers when trying to pick the company they do or do not want to invest in. Very, very high on the agenda here as well was the par 30 in the portfolio health. And we'll take that further during this webinar and in the process afterwards. And here as well, the business performance and benchmarking came forward as really, really a desired KPI from the sector, from companies, besides the financial only KPIs. Interestingly was that where the companies that participated in the pilot, they were very much in favor of the standardized metrics. Some of the others still think it is too difficult to reach. And also their view on calculated data versus raw data collection was more nuanced. So where the companies in the pilot said it's definitely calculated KPIs only, the broader consultation was also more nuanced on that. And very important outcome that I would like to highlight is the reporting aspect, where many companies have said, you know, calculating KPIs is one thing, but then how we share that to a broader public, it is very important. And this is basically the thing that will decide on how stakeholders will interpret the outcomes of the KPIs. Luckily, everyone that we talked to said that it is a process that it is good to continue, and that it is good to continue it together. So we will, the companies really wanted to stay included. They wanted to be consulted. They wanted to work along. And they also see that it is a process that should be very inclusive with other stakeholders as well. And I think with that, it's good to take a look at those other stakeholders. And I will hand it over to Nikki, who will tell more about the investor consultations that we have done.
And if I can, this is Russell again. If I could just note to folks that on your panel, you're able to ask questions through the chat function, which we will be tracking and responding to later. Go ahead, Nikki. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No worries, Russell. To round out our stakeholder consultations, we spoke with a cross-section of investors in the space. CGAP and IFC jointly held 20 conversations with PayGo Solar investors, while GOGLA also fielded some informal perspectives from a group of investors. We use these conversations to help us gain some insights into some common challenges investors are facing that are unique in the space, to understand how the current set of KPIs are being used or not, and how these can be improved, and the level of interest in participating in an open process to review and refine KPIs. Next slide, please. Nearly all of the investors were familiar with the KPIs, but hadn't been using them explicitly to identify investment opportunities or to track their investments. Rather, they were using their own indicators and analytics, which may have included some of the KPIs or KPIs that were similar, but had slightly different components. It's worth pointing out that while much of the discussion in the space is around the variety of business models employed, it's also attracted a diverse set of investors. Each of these investors has a unique perspective based on the instruments they use to invest, their investor base, their investment goals, and how their investment principles are incentivized. One of the clearest distinctions is between equity and debt investors. Equity investors are, of course, focused on the potential for long-term growth, whereas debt investors are focused on nearer-term repayment. As such, they have very different due diligence processes and levels of flexibility. Multiple debt investors noted that prospective investees in the solar PayGo space struggled with a transition in due diligence requirements from equity to debt. All investors agreed on the importance of using the same definitions for commonly used metrics in the industry. Next slide, please. The current level of inconsistency in reported data across the industry translates to more time spent on reconciliation, which also means that PayGo Solar investment processes can be more expensive relative to other industries. This inconsistency can start at the very top of the income statement, as many investors noted that the companies weren't uniform in their methods of accounting for revenue when making a credit sale. Similarly, differing interpretations of delinquency, among other things, made PAR an inconsistent standalone metric to use. Instead, many investors developed bespoke metrics and analytics, pulling raw data from the companies. Many noted that benchmarking would allow investors to follow trends, further refine heuristics, and bring in more investors. Next slide, please. Some interesting industry-wide insights also came out of our discussions. Many equity investors pointed to exceedingly high valuation expectations as a barrier to entry. Investors across the board indicated a preference for more focus by companies on understanding and improving portfolio quality. Directly related to the intensiveness of the due diligence processes, investors, especially debt investors, noted upward pressure on their average investment quantums. The stifling effect of DFI activity in the space on commercial investment was also noted a number of times, particularly by commercial debt investors. There were multiple sightings of commercial debt investors being significantly undercut by DFIs. Alternatively, they indicated a strong desire to work together to get more commercial capital into the capital stack, providing more precedents and ultimately improved credit access overall for the industry. Next slide, please. Investors were aligned with companies in their desire to participate in a process to review and refine the KPIs and other tools used to measure performance. Many noted the need for consistent KPIs across the industry for reliable apples-to-apples comparisons. These KPIs wouldn't supersede internal due diligence processes, but would allow for additional checks and recalibration, ultimately leading to more effective and efficient processes. Next. So what would such a process for reviewing and refining metrics, analytics, and reporting standards in an industry look like? To be truly effective, it's important that this process be open and transparent, that it be self-subscribing and jointly owned, that it be technically focused and aimed at fostering objectivity, that it have clear governing mechanisms to drive toward consensus, that it benefits from a representative group, ensuring that all of the different business models and stages are considered. Given the many different stakeholders involved in the industry, it's key that we're proactive in achieving this balance of voices. That means making sure different PAYGO business models are represented, that investors invest across various instruments, segments, life cycles, and return profiles to share their views, and that other key players in the space, such as DFIs and foundations, have a channel to share their perspectives. Next slide, please. Who are the different players in the process? Gogla IFC and CGAP are partnering to oversee this initiative as members of the steering group. This has organically evolved from our interactions to consult on and review the initial set of KPIs, and the view that our outline process is critical to achieving the desired results. All three organizations are aligned with a strong interest in seeing the PAYGO solar industry grow. Complementary resources and skills that they can bring to bear in guiding the industry process. The steering group will bring stakeholders together, guide the strategic direction of the process, and propose the initial framework. Next slide, please. The CUNT is the backbone of the PAYGO Perform initiative. It's made up of the broadest set of stakeholders in the PAYGO solar space. The consultative group will meet periodically and will provide the credit needed to move the process forward from recommendation to testing to adoption. Technical working groups are comprised of members of the consultative group who want to be more closely involved in shaping guidance for the industry. We're hoping that each will be co-chaired by a company and an investor. We'll bring in technical experts when needed. The working groups will have a technical focus in that they'll collect data, analyze, and recommend, and they'll meet regularly. Next slide, please. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but we wanted to include a reference that outlines a typical process where a technical working group is formed to focus on a particular task and comes back with a recommendation. Next slide, please. Based on our consultation consultations and the survey we sent out in November, we've identified 3 technical working groups to get things started. The first group will focus on KPIs overall, reviewing the current set and making changes where necessary with a keen eye toward promoting comparability. The second group will focus on portfolio quality metrics and analytics. This goes beyond taking a hard look at PAR, but also looking into analytical frameworks such as cohort analysis. The third group will delve into unit economics, taking a close look at a tool many investors use to determine business viability from a unit perspective and outline a common process that can be used not only by investors, but also by companies to diagnose and address fundamental issues as they scale. IFC is doing some work in parallel developing a framework called the Pathway to Profitability, and there's some opportunity here to leverage that work and expertise. You'll also note that there's a good deal of overlap between these groups. These groups aren't intended to work in silos. Rather, we see them working together and drawing from one another as needed. For example, the KPI group will draw heavily from the expertise of the portfolio quality group as they focus on related measures. But it's important that one group be responsible for the KPIs as a whole, so they can employ a holistic view and more ably work toward an efficient and exhaustive list. Just as we did during the workshop in Kigali, we'll be collecting your views on these groups shortly in a poll. Next slide, please. What are we working toward? We put together a high-level timeline to outline our thinking. We're hoping to finalize and initiate the working groups in the first quarter of the new year. The groups will report a recommendation of an updated set of KPIs, progress of which is slated to be shared during the June. Soon after, we hope to pilot and use learnings of pilot to update the KPIs. Next slide, please. What's next? We'll be sending out invitations shortly to be part of the working group with the aim of getting things moving in January. So please keep an eye out for that. We're looking for a diverse set of perspectives, so please also circulate to your colleagues and industry contacts. You can also indicate your interest now via the chat function or email interest to the address on the screen. Next slide, please. We move to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. We'd like to gather some valuable feedback from you via a 4-question live poll. Your responses will help guide us in our next steps. Immediately after I read through each question and its options, you'll have an opportunity to indicate your selection through a window that will pop up on your side. We'll then pause and show the live results before proceeding to the next question. Question 1. Overall, do you believe this process will lead to better tools and diagnostics to measure and report performance? A. Yes, without question. I think this process led by these institutions will lead to a reporting mechanism that is credible, robust, well thought through. B. Yes, but. I think the overall outline of the process is solid, but we should address a few minor details to make it more effective. C. Maybe. The objective is on the mark, but some fundamental issues need to be addressed to maximize the value of this initiative. And D. It's a long shot. I don't think this proposed process will lead to a credible mechanism, i.e. it's too complex, and there are too many participants. The decision-making process is too convoluted, etc. So now, hopefully, you're seeing a pop-up on your side with some radio buttons. Please select the option that corresponds to your response. Great. So we're seeing a lot of yeses. That's good. This is obviously there's a variety of opinions, and of those that shared yes buts and maybes and it's a long shot, We'd love to hear from you, either through the chat dialogues here today or through a survey that will be shared later on, which will give you an opportunity to share some of your thoughts. Feedback is really critical for the success of this process, so please share your thoughts. Next question. Question 2. Recognizing the challenge of balancing between inclusiveness and efficiency, do you think we struck the balance correctly? A, no, we need more inclusiveness. The process seems driven by just a few organizations and some voices will not be sufficiently heard. It may be more inefficient to be more inclusive, but it's worth the time and effort. B, yes, we struck the right balance of being able to build off the experience and knowledge of a broad group of stakeholders, while also being conducive to productively driving toward conclusions. C, no, we need more efficiency. The process outline is too ambitious, and although I feel that we're onto something, for PAYGO Perform to really work, we'll need to trim something, either limit stakeholders and or be less ambitious in what we will achieve with the reporting. And I just want to reiterate at this point, before we move to the polling questions, that you can write questions in the chat dialogue. So if you've got any questions to any of the topics that we're covering now or even before, please write them in the dialogue, and when we break out for Q&A, we'll address them. Okay, a lot of folks on the call indicate yes. There are definitely those that are pushing for more inclusiveness or efficiency. Again, we'd love to hear from you on your thoughts on why you feel that way and what you would like to see to move things more closer to your liking. Next question, please. How did we do in selecting the 3 working groups? Did we get it right? And as a reminder, the first group was focusing on the KPIs overall. The second group was focused on portfolio quality. And the third was on unit economics. A, yes, nailed it. B, pretty close. The working groups are in pretty good shape, but some minor tweaking is needed to get it just right. C, on the right track, but missing something critical. The framework and process seem okay, but there's a critical blind spot that needs to be addressed. D, go back to the drawing board. The design of the process and the working groups are fundamentally flawed. E, sorry, were you saying something? I was just catching up on emails. Okay. Overall, it seems like we're kind of on the right track here. Again, for those that think we're slightly off to really off, Would love to hear your thoughts here. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, these groups were informed by responses from what I want to say that is the first wave of respondents. So if you can give us your thoughts on how we can improve the different working groups, how they should work together, what kinds of goals that they should be working on, that will be really helpful in shaping things before going too far down the wrong track. Question 4, how do you see yourself contributing to PAYGO Perform? A, sign me up. I'm keen to be involved and could see myself joining or leading a technical working group. Fully understanding that this means I need to meet the expectations of my peers on deliverables, deadlines, and outcomes. B, I can contribute here and there. I won't be able to lead a working group or invest too much time, but these are critical issues, and I'm keen to participate with less time-intensive tasks like actively participating in occasional calls and webinars. C, keep me posted. This is a good initiative and one that I want to be tracking, but I won't have time to do more than follow progress. And finally, D, this is not directly relevant to my work and I don't have time. I see this as tangential to what I do, even if it leads to eventual outcomes. Okay, good. We're seeing an array of responses here. We're getting some good indications that people are interested in being part of the process. That's great. Obviously, people have different time commitments and are able to devote different levels of time. We're hoping as the process becomes a bit more concrete for everyone, that they'll have a better sense of how much time they can devote and how effective that time will be. So that's great. For those of you that are interested, again, I encourage you to indicate your interest, what group you're interested in being a part of, whether you want to co-chair that or be a participant, and in general, what level of engagement you're willing to give. This is really critical that we have a broad set of voices across the industry participating in this process. And with that, I'll hand it over to Russell for our Q&A.
Thanks, Nikki. I am not able to see questions. I don't know if one of the other panelists has figured out how to see the questions. Or perhaps Johanna from Gogla or Naomi from IFC. If you guys are able on your screens to see the questions, I'd like to ask that you pick it up. Not seeing it.
I see. Yes, I see the questions coming in.
Okay, please pick it up.
So far, only questions that were one-on-one about the sound. We have one question here. Can you give me more information about how the working groups will work? So maybe we can elaborate on that one.
Yes,
sure,
go for it, Nikki.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So one, the focus areas of the different working groups, and they have their mandate, will will outline a process and a timeline for which they'll work on their particular deliverable. So let's say it's the portfolio quality group. They're going to dig in on the different metrics, potential and currently used, and the different analytics that can be used to indicate portfolio quality of a Pago Solar company. They'll reach out to different players in the space. They'll have access to various resources that we'll make available to them. They'll let us know where they need additional support, and we'll work with them so that they can provide these deliverables, which are going to be metrics and analytics that will help the industry better gauge portfolio quality across the board. They'll also work with the KPI group to help them when they're working on the portfolio quality segments within their mandate.
That is perfect. And maybe there is another one coming. What are the major milestones and timelines for the working group?
I can also respond to that. So far, we've slated the Gogla AGM in June as a period in time where we're going to come up with the set of indicators and analytics, give or take that time period. We'll definitely try to have some significant progress by then. And what we're hoping to do soon thereafter, within the second half of the year, is begin piloting these with the companies, similar to what Gogla has done with the initial set of KPIs, so that we can further refine these indicators and these analytics and get a kind of a broader section of responses when it is in practice. And then after that, after we've hopefully worked out some of those kinks, we hope to formally introduce that set of indicators and metrics.
I have another question coming in, which is, how will you keep me informed if I don't join a working group?
So we're going to go ahead, Nikki.
I think that's also a good question. We have to set up an efficient mechanism for communicating. So far, we've been reaching out through which is the same channel that presumably reached you this time. But hopefully we're hoping to have one means of reaching out for this particular. For the time being, expect to get responses through the Gogla newsletter, through communications from CGAP and Lighting Global, as you have. And if there's something that you're missing out on, or you're in this in keeping in track of what's going on, again, just respond in the chat box, the email way you got webinar, and let us know that you're interested in touch.
I have another question, which is, what is going to happen with the initial KPIs?
I'll pick this up. It's Russell Sturm. The initial KPIs represent the sort of foundation here, but this is a dynamic process, and the KPIs themselves, let's recognize that they don't. It's not a calculus. It's not a calculator, and out comes the other end as an answer. These are standardized measurement tools that can then be deployed as needed, and depending upon how business models evolve, and depending upon how the perspective of different types of investors, whether they're debt, equity, or guarantees, or others, the KPI needs will change too. So this is a dynamic process. The initial KPIs remain at the core, but the process we intend to evolve with the needs of the sector. And so the KPIs could look somewhat different 2 years from now, depending upon how the industry evolves.
Thank you, Russell. I have one which is a bit longer. How willing are participants, PAYGO companies, to share more data, seeing how these KPIs are very specific and rely on availability and reliability of data? The industry seems to be quite competitive, and most companies are likely to limit how much information they are willing to share.
That has certainly been the experience to date, that there have been a few PAYGO companies that have asserted leadership, recognizing the importance of this, but they all enter this process sort of dipping toes in the water. The objective here for all of us, I think, is the maturation of this sector to behave like any other sector, where transparency becomes the key to a common understanding of performance, to a common understanding of what the standards of the sector are, and to standardization and potentially securitization of the assets of payables. For that to happen, transparency has to emerge and trust has to emerge. And so one reason that we've structured this as an initiative which is jointly owned by everybody and not simply the confidential information of 3 organizations, or where this becomes an asset of ours. This is an asset of the sector, and so it's an evolutionary process.
Yes, Russell, and maybe I can share from that on that from the pilot that we have run, and also from the consultations that we have had after that with all the companies, because I think exactly this question was one of our key challenges and our key fears, that indeed companies would in the end not be willing to share any data, so that it would remain an exercise on paper but never implemented. However, what we noticed was when we were doing the pilot, and also after that when talking to the companies on their views on sharing those data, companies were willing to share, especially calculated KPIs, a little less the raw data, but they were willing to share KPIs. Important to them was what after that happens with them. So how are data going to be aggregated and how are they going to be reported upon? It is important that all data remains private, it remains anonymous, it remains non-trackable to specific companies. So as soon as we start reporting, I think those are important criteria to take along. In general, the companies that we have included in the consultation so far, they said that as long as those criteria were met, they were more willing to share their data than what we actually anticipated a year ago. Let me see if there's other questions that have come in while I was talking. I have one here about the diversity of business models and how the KPIs will take that into account. And you have the diversity of business models as well as the diversities of geographies. Anyone who wants to take lead on that?
I'm happy to respond to that. That is one of the areas that was really highlighted in the survey we sent in November, the focus on comparability and making sure that these KPIs are relevant across the different types of business models. And that's definitely what the KPI group will be tasked with making sure of, boiling down where possible the KPIs to indicators that apply broadly but not getting so specific as to render them very esoteric. Of course, there will certainly be there may be some indicators that will be a bit more focused on particular business models, but we recognize to start out with indicators that apply a bit more broadly to get others a bit more comfortable with the space and what it can do. But that's part of what the bright minds and the technical working groups will be focusing on.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more last question. I have a question coming in. Please clarify the initial lessons about PAR and objective of that working group.
I can respond to this as well. During the workshop in Kigali, we actually used PAR as one of the metrics to kind of dig into in a breakout session, and there were, of course, a variety of opinions about the PAR metric is. Also, a lot indicating that a lot of that usefulness or lack of usefulness stems from different practices around accounting for delinquency, or just different methods of reporting it in general. So that the group will focus on whether or not PAR as a standalone makes sense, or maybe in concert with some other indicator, a completely different metric altogether. The key is not to focus so much on having it be a standalone metric that speaks for the industry in terms of its performance. And I think there's also a lot of maybe some carryover from the MFI industry, but coming up with an indicator that makes sense for this industry. Now, you know, whether or not that's PAR or some different named PAR-like metric is left up to the working group. And of course, that will be worked on within the working group, but also shared with the consultative group, which is all of you, for feedback.
I think that was the last question that we had coming in. So Russell, shall I hand it over to you for some final words?
Certainly. So
one quick response to that. What I neglected to say is utilization came out as one metric that could potentially work alongside or replace PAR. So that was one of the key kind of responses from our workshop. But again, that was just you know, about 10 to 15 minutes spent on that. So I'm sure a lot can come out from a working group. Sorry.
So that's fine. Well, thanks, Nikki, and thanks, Daphne, and everyone from the GOGLA and CGAP and IFC teams that have been supporting this initiative. This is an industry initiative. This is not a tripartite organizational ownership thing. And I hope we've been able to convey this. It is absolutely essential for the maturation of this sector that we develop transparency in the operations, and that this becomes an understandable sector for the key commercial investment players that we need alongside us in order to reach the scale needed around energy access. So thank you everyone for joining this hour. Please view this as your first step to join the initiative. This is an industry-wide effort, and it's only going to succeed to the extent that everyone owns it and participates. Thank you very much.